The old cemetery chapel loomed in the distance, its silhouette framed by the twisted iron gates and the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the overgrown trees. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, as if the world itself held its breath, anticipating something unspeakable. Samantha stood at the rusted gate, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. She glanced at Eli, Ava, and Sophie, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of their lanterns. The invitation to the Midnight Séance Society had seemed like a thrill, a way to remember their friend who had disappeared a year ago. But now, standing before the chapel, doubt began to settle in. The heavy wooden door creaked as they pushed it open, a sound that seemed to echo endlessly in the emptiness of the chapel. Dust particles floated in the air, caught in the beams of their flashlights, revealing the worn pews and the cracked altar at the far end. The chapel was a relic of a time long past, abandoned and forgotten by the town, except for the few who dared to enter on All Hallows Eve. Samantha could feel a presence in the air, a whisper that brushed against the edge of her mind, urging her to continue forward. Eli gave her a reassuring nod, though his eyes betrayed a hint of unease. Ava and Sophie followed, their steps hesitant as they crossed the threshold. They gathered in a circle near the altar, the candles they brought flickering as if touched by an unseen breeze. Samantha placed the photograph of their missing friend in the center, her heart pounding as she muttered the words they had found in an old book of rituals. The room seemed to darken with each word, the candle's flames shrinking as shadows lengthened across the stone walls. The air grew colder still, and an unnatural silence enveloped them, as though the world outside had ceased to exist. Sophie shivered, her eyes darting around the room, while Ava clasped her hands together, her knuckles white. A sudden gust of wind blew through the chapel, extinguishing the candles all at once. The darkness was immediate and absolute, and for a moment panic gripped Samantha's chest. She fumbled for her flashlight, her fingers trembling as she clicked it on, the beam slicing through the darkness. Eli's voice broke the silence, a forced laugh as he tried to lighten the mood, but it only made the atmosphere more oppressive. They could hear something, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against stone, coming from the back of the chapel. Samantha's flashlight wavered as she turned it toward the noise, the beam revealing nothing but empty pews and shadows that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. Samantha took a deep breath, her voice steadying as she called out into the darkness, asking for their friend's spirit to join them. The rustling grew louder, a chill running down her spine as the shadows seemed to gather, coalescing near the altar. Ava gasped, her flashlight catching a fleeting glimpse of something, a figure pale and translucent standing just beyond the circle. Sophie's breath hitched, and Samantha's heart skipped a beat. The figure seemed familiar, its outline resembling their friend. But there was something off, something wrong. The air grew heavy and the sensation of being watched became overwhelming, as if 100 unseen eyes were fixed upon them. The figure at the edge of the circle seemed to flicker, fading in and out as if struggling to remain. Samantha swallowed hard, her eyes locked on the apparition. "Is it really you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Eli stepped closer, his flashlight trembling as he directed the beam toward the figure. It flickered once more before vanishing completely, leaving only the oppressive darkness and the chill that seemed to seep into their bones. Ava's breathing grew ragged, her gaze darting around the chapel, as if expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. "We shouldn't be here," Sophie muttered, her voice tinged with fear. But Samantha shook her head, determined to see this through. The air in the chapel grew colder still, each breath forming mist as they huddled closer together. Eli knelt by the altar, examining the photograph that now lay face down on the cold stone floor. He picked it up, his eyes widening as he noticed something different. The face of their friend, once smiling, now looked twisted in pain, the features distorted as if screaming. He held it up for the others to see, and a shiver ran through Samantha. "This isn't right," she whispered, her voice cracking. The photograph felt heavier in Eli's hand, almost as if it were resisting being held, and he quickly set it back down, his face pale. A sudden noise echoed through the chapel, a scraping sound like nails dragging across stone. Samantha turned her flashlight toward the back of the chapel, her heart pounding in her chest. The beam revealed the source of the noise, a door they hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind a collapsed pew. It was slowly opening, the hinges groaning in protest. "Where does that lead?" Ava asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No one had an answer, but Samantha felt an inexplicable pull toward it. The darkness beyond the door seemed to beckon, a deep void that promised answers, or perhaps more questions. Despite her fear, Samantha took a step forward, her flashlight aimed at the door. Eli reached out, grabbing her arm. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Samantha hesitated, but the urge to uncover the truth was too strong. She nodded, pulling away from his grip. Ava and Sophie exchanged nervous glances before following, their flashlights flickering as if protesting their advance. The door creaked open further, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into the darkness. The cold air seemed to grow even more frigid, and a sense of dread settled over them. But Samantha pressed on, her footsteps echoing as she descended. The stairs led them into a chamber beneath the chapel, the walls lined with ancient carvings and symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. A strange energy filled the air, a low hum that resonated deep within their bones. In the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal, and atop it lay an old, tattered book. The pages fluttered as if caught in a breeze, though the air was deathly still. Samantha approached the pedestal, her eyes drawn to the book. Eli, Ava, and Sophie stood behind her, their flashlights casting long shadows across the chamber walls. The sense of being watched had not lessened. If anything, it had grown stronger, the unseen eyes now feeling closer, more focused. Samantha reached out, her fingers hovering over the tattered book before finally making contact. The instant she touched it, a shock ran up her arm, and the low hum in the chamber grew louder, almost a roar. The carvings on the walls began to glow, their shapes shifting as if alive. Eli, Ava, and Sophie stepped back, their eyes wide with fear as the symbols twisted into faces. Anguished, screaming faces that seemed to cry out for release. Samantha pulled her hand away, but the book seemed to pulse, its pages turning on their own, revealing text written in a language none of them recognized. A wind began to swirl around the chamber, lifting the dust from the floor and making the candles flicker wildly. The shadows on the walls moved as if they had come alive, detaching themselves and circling the group. Ava screamed, her flashlight beam darting around as the shadows grew closer, their forms dark and featureless. Samantha clutched the book to her chest, her mind racing. She knew somehow that this book held the answers they sought, but it was also the source of the danger they faced. The faces in the carvings seemed to watch her, their expressions shifting between agony and expectation. Eli grabbed Samantha's arm, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. "We have to leave!" he shouted, but Samantha shook her head, her eyes locked on the book. The pages were still turning, each one revealing more of the strange text, and she felt a compulsion to read it aloud. The words formed in her mind, unbidden, and her lips moved before she could stop herself. As she spoke, the wind intensified, and the shadows seemed to freeze, their attention fixed on her. The others watched in horror as the chamber darkened, the light from their flashlights swallowed by the encroaching blackness. The figure they had seen in the chapel reappeared, standing at the edge of the chamber, its form clearer now. A young girl, her face pale and eyes hollow. Sophie gasped, her hand covering her mouth as she recognized their missing friend. The girl's mouth moved, but no sound came out, her eyes locking onto Samantha. The shadows recoiled from her, as if afraid, and Samantha felt a pang of sorrow mixed with fear. "She needs our help," Samantha whispered, her voice breaking. The girl raised a hand pointing toward the book, and Samantha understood. This was the key to freeing her, but it came with a cost. The carvings on the walls began to crack, pieces of stone falling away as the chamber seemed to tremble. Samantha knew they had little time. She looked back at Eli, Ava, and Sophie, their faces pale with fear. "Trust me," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. She opened the book to the final page, the text glowing with an eerie light. The shadows drew closer again, their forms writhing, but the girl stepped forward, her hand resting on Samantha's shoulder. Samantha took a deep breath and read the final words aloud, the chamber erupting in light as the shadows let out a collective wail, their forms dissolving into nothingness. As the brilliant light faded, the chamber fell into an uneasy stillness. Samantha blinked, her vision adjusting to the sudden darkness that now seemed less oppressive. The carvings on the walls had stopped moving, their anguished faces now appearing serene, as though they had finally found peace. The air was no longer heavy, and the chill that had gripped them seemed to dissipate. Samantha turned to the others, her heart pounding as she saw their expressions, a mixture of relief and disbelief. Eli stepped forward, his flashlight flickering back to life, casting a soft glow across the chamber. "Is it over?" Ava asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes locked on the now quiet pedestal. The figure of their missing friend still stood at the edge of the chamber, her form now more solid, her eyes no longer hollow. Samantha felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of hope and sorrow, as she approached the girl. "We did it," Samantha whispered, her voice trembling. The girl nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips, and for a moment the room seemed warmer. Sophie's eyes welled with tears, and she reached out, her hand passing through the girl's shoulder as if she were made of mist. The girl looked at each of them in turn, her gaze lingering on Samantha before she began to fade, her form dissolving into a soft glow that filled the room. The glow spread across the chamber, touching the walls and the ceiling, illuminating the ancient carvings with a gentle light. The book on the pedestal closed itself, the pages no longer fluttering, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. Eli let out a shaky breath, lowering his flashlight. "She's at peace now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Samantha nodded, wiping away a tear as she looked around the chamber. The oppressive sense of being watched had lifted, replaced by a feeling of calm. Ava and Sophie exchanged a glance, their expressions softening as they realized that whatever dark force had held their friend was finally gone. Slowly, they made their way back up the narrow staircase, their footsteps echoing in the now quiet chapel. The air felt lighter, and the sense of dread that had hung over them was gone, replaced by a strange serenity. Samantha paused at the top of the stairs, looking back down into the darkness one last time. The tattered book remained on the pedestal, but it no longer seemed threatening, just an old relic, its power spent. Eli placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a small nod. "We should go," he said softly. Samantha took a deep breath and turned away, leading the group out of the chamber and back into the chapel. The chapel door creaked as they pushed it open, the cold night air rushing in to meet them. The moon hung high in the sky, its light spilling over the cemetery and casting long shadows across the graves. Samantha stepped out first, her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. She looked back at the chapel, the old building now seeming less sinister, almost peaceful in the moonlight. Ava, Eli, and Sophie joined her, their faces reflecting a shared sense of relief and closure. "We did it," Ava said, her voice filled with wonder. Samantha smiled, the weight of the past year finally lifting from her shoulders as they turned away from the chapel, the darkness behind them fading into memory. The group walked slowly through the cemetery, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound as they moved away from the chapel. The tension that had weighed them down for so long seemed to lift with each step, replaced by a sense of peace they hadn't felt in a year. Samantha looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling brightly, as if offering silent comfort. "She's finally free," she whispered. Her voice carried on the gentle breeze. Eli nodded beside her, his face softened by the moonlight, and Ava smiled, her expression one of quiet relief. Sophie wiped a tear from her cheek, her eyes bright. As they approached the cemetery gates, the wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of laughter, a soft, echoing reminder of the friend they had lost. Samantha paused, her breath catching, and for a moment she thought she saw a fleeting figure among the graves, a girl with a familiar smile. She blinked, and the vision was gone, leaving only the swaying branches of the old trees. "She's at peace now," Samantha said, her voice filled with conviction. The others nodded in agreement, their expressions a mixture of sadness and hope. It wasn't the ending they had wanted, but it was closure, and that was enough. They stepped out of the cemetery, the rusted iron gate creaking as they pushed it open. The town lay beyond, quiet and still, the distant glow of streetlights a comforting sight. Samantha turned to Eli, Ava, and Sophie, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I couldn't have done this without you." Eli smiled, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We did this together," he replied, his voice steady. Ava nodded, her eyes glistening, and Sophie gave a small, brave smile. The bond between them felt stronger now, forged by the ordeal they had faced and overcome. As they made their way back to the car, parked just beyond the cemetery's edge, Samantha glanced back one last time. The chapel stood in the distance, its silhouette framed by the moonlight. No longer a place of fear, but a symbol of what they had faced and conquered. The wind rustled through the trees, and she felt a warmth in her chest, a sense that their friend was watching over them, no longer in pain, no longer lost. It was time to move forward, to live their lives without the weight of the past dragging them down. Samantha took a deep breath, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. They reached the car, and as they climbed in, Samantha looked at her friends, their faces tired but content. "Let's go home," she said, her voice filled with determination. Eli started the engine, and the car rumbled to life, the headlights cutting through the darkness as they pulled away from the cemetery. The road ahead was clear, the town awaiting them with its familiar streets and warm lights. Samantha closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sense of closure wash over her. They had faced the shadows and emerged victorious, and now it was time to embrace the light of a new beginning.